The title of his presentation is "The Typology of Social Media Regulations," and I will not interrupt you at 11 because that has already passed. So,
thank you very much, and welcome everyone. It's really a pleasure and honor to be here and meet at least some of you in person after all these months of awful online conferences. We are well ahead of our schedule, so I'll be brief because we all know, at least in Hungary, that's true, that in a scientific conferences the most important part is the coffee break. So I don't want to shorten the scheduled amount of time for that. Just a few introductory words. It is a well-known truism, and the book that's been published recently by our research group is absolutely underlines this statement that the online gatekeepers and social media platforms generally have enormous influence on the public sphere, and it's a new feature of these platforms that the private power is not only a threat to government integrity or government power, but also dangerous to private individuals, to the freedom of expression. In Europe, we generally think that private power is or can be as dangerous as government repression, so power needs to be restricted somehow, whether it originates from the government or from private entities. There is in my paper, I collected these types of regulation. Theoretically, they are all possibilities, and theoretically they can all lead to meaningful solutions or meaningful answers to the problem of online platforms. At the end of my presentation, we'll see that not all of them can inform future debates and future legislations, at least in my opinion. Let's start with number one. No regulation is a theoretically possible answer. Scientific works published in the 90s introduced this Wild West metaphor into the public. Basically, the idea was that internet needs not be regulated, at least not by the central government or governments. Certain groups, communities present on the internet will regulate themselves. After more than 3 decades, we don't think that these metaphor, this analogy is desirable or theoretically feasible. In the case of online platforms, there's a utopia from the 90s, and the users of major online platforms are not in the situation to regulate themselves or the platforms they use, so I don't think that this can be a way forward. Self-regulation is known from the press law, press regulation. Self-regulation can mean different kinds of things. It's just one definition is present on this slide. According to I mean, in my understanding, it is a process whereby an organization volunteers to monitor its own adherence to legal ethical standards before the government steps up and enforces similar kinds of standards. As I said, the press regulation just provides some experience with that. There are successful and less successful attempts to regulate the press this way. Just remember the UK scandal from 2011, the News of the World scandal, which just swept away the previous system of press self-regulation, and now in the UK we have a similar kinds of self-regulation. Theoretically, the self-regulation can be internal or independent. Independent is in inverted commas because this independence can only be conditional in all types of self-regulatory systems in Europe. The appointment of the decision-making body is made by the industry actors themselves. Self-regulatory bodies are financed by industry players, and they usually have weak sanctioning powers. So all these criteria, all these features lead to the conclusion that his independence is conditional, or to put it more bluntly, non-existent. So in the case of online platforms with major international technological giants, it is really difficult to imagine a situation where an efficient self-regulatory system can work, and that is mainly for economic interest. Facebook started its oversight board last year. That is in some ways it can be considered as a self-regulatory system, because Facebook theoretically submits itself under the decisions of the board, but the members of the board were appointed by Facebook itself. It's funded by Facebook, so probably it's a self-regulatory tool that is an obstacle to state regulation or legal regulation. At least that is the aim of the social media platform. The third is co-regulation. Also, we can mean different kinds of things on, and I use this very simple definition. So, in my understanding, co-regulation is a joint effort by state authorities or state bodies and industry actors, which combines a system of codified law, so legal regulation, and self-regulation. It is an umbrella term. Many possible forms and shades of cooperation exist in the field of media and also in other industries as well. Generally, it's also voluntary by definition, but also mandatory forms exist, and as I understand, the two most important EU directives in this field, they both introduce a very special type of co-regulatory system. Number one is the e-commerce directive. All the chapters in the book need to refer to this directive. This is the most important piece of legislation in Europe at the moment, so it's all well known to everyone in this room. Just a very brief overview, and I will only focus on Article 14 and 15 of the directive. According to this legislation, platforms may not be subject to any general monitoring obligation that is set in Article 15, but they are required to remove any violating content after they become aware of its infringing nature. That is what we call the notice and take down conditional liability system. In this case, platforms need to decide upon the legality or infringing nature of a certain piece of user's content, and that is what I find problematic. So I just like to highlight problem number one here. Legal regulation forces the platforms into a decision-making role with regard to user content. That is basically, in my opinion, the outsourcing of the application of legal rules and free speech doctrines. Private entities need to make decisions on free speech, and maybe we can conclude that it is necessary in the case of online platforms, but from a constitutional law perspective, it is also problematic, to say the least. The second important EU legislation is the Audiovisual Media Services Directive after 2018. So the last amendment of this directive, a new definition was introduced, the video sharing platform service. They also include the audiovisual content of social media platforms. And it also introduces a special co-regulatory system. Member states must ensure that video sharing platform providers take appropriate measures to ensure the aims of the directive, that is the protection of minors, deleting incitement to violence, hatred against the community, or advocacy of terrorism, that is, I left it out from the slide, and also the lawfulness of commercial communications. So it's not directly aiming at the content, rather the procedure, but also leaves the conditional liability system of the e-commerce directive in place. Number 4 is private regulation. That is probably the most important issue in the case of online platforms. Platforms may enforce private regulation of the user's content through the contract, through the terms of service in their contract. So they are basically free to filter user content, block, suspend users' accounts, or even delete these accounts. That is what happened to President Trump back in January this year. These are all made in the name of safety and the protection from harmful content. And even protection from dangerous or harmful content may seem necessary, and even governments approve this and agree with this approach, so they even try to enforce the platforms to step up even more effectively against harmful and dangerous content. We cannot forget that it also collides with the constitutional freedom of expression doctrines. What is dangerous and what is harmful is not necessarily illegal, and so it's a very shady area where platforms need to make the decision on not illegal but still harmful users' content. The oversight board I referred to already can also be considered a kind of a private regulation, because it also regulates user speech. So what the board says is basically a decision on the harmfulness or non-harmfulness of users' speech. So here we arrive to problem number 2. These private speech codes, these private standards set up by online platforms that can have a legal binding force between the parties through the contract. They do not observe any free speech guarantees, and the legal regulation as it is at the moment allows these platforms to regulate the users privately without the constitutional guarantees of fundamental rights. Another feature of this private regulation is probably less visible, but maybe even more dangerous. That is the curation of users' content. Content curation practices like upranking or prioritization or downranking. Basically, it's a decision by the platform made through the AI, also used by the platform, decides what is visible for the public and what is hidden from the public's view. So even if a certain piece of content is not deleted, even if a certain user's account is not suspended, still content can be hidden or other content can be pushed to the users. This is what I call a special type of editing. It's not the same as the editing of legacy media in every aspect, but in many aspects it is similar to that. The consequence of this curation is that users do not necessarily meet opinions that contradict their own personal views. They can be manipulated, as we saw in the Cambridge Analytica case, and these practices by the platforms can close their users into a filter bubble that leads to the further divide between individual societies, and that can be problematic. So problem number 3 is set on the slide. These personalized services which is basically the foundations of these online platforms, can reduce content diversity and selection of news the individual users can come across when using the platforms, and that is something that was, to say the least, was not visible in the 90s, where everyone thought that diversity and content pluralism is solved by the newly introduced internet services. Number 5 is contract law. Contract law is a newcomer in the field of media regulation. So far, we never thought that the law of contract or private law can be important or interesting in this field, but it's getting more and more important now. There's a theoretical solution in the German legal system. It exists in practice, and we have now some case law from Germany which informs our further thinking about this theoretical possibility. According to the German Drittwirkung doctrine, the application of public law rules can directly affect legal relations between private individuals, even if it is not explicitly stated in the user's contract. Applying the constitutional freedom of expression doctrines is it's an obligation established by the Bürgerliches Gesetzbuch in Germany. No matter what the terms of service of Twitter or YouTube or Facebook says on this topic. So maybe contract law is a way forward. And last but not least, media regulation. Media regulation, as we now know it, that is mainly broadcasting regulation and regulation of on-demand media services. It's probably not something that we can, by analogy, we can extend to cover social media platforms as a whole, but still can influence future decision-making, future legislation. The problem of curation is a danger to content diversity. Diversity and pluralism are the most important objectives of media regulation in Europe. We have a very detailed and nuanced media regulation toolbox. All of these provisions aim to enhance diversity and pluralism. So ownership concentration, control, right of reply, impartial news coverage in news programs, must carry rules for media distributors, and obligation to cover local news or broadcast public service content. They are all well known in European media regulations. And though I don't think that these rules can be directly applicable in the case of online platforms, the ideas behind them, the principles, can still inform future legislation or future debates. There's legislation and proposals everywhere in Europe. Quite recently, the first one was the well-known German Netzwerkdurchsetzungsgesetz, and then Austria came, France came. The French legislation was declared as unconstitutional by the Conseil Constitutionnel, but the main idea behind it was still considered to be valid. All of this legislation aim to increase the existing burden of platforms by reinforcing the need for management of content and its deletion where it's necessary. So if a certain piece of content is in breach of the criminal code of Germany, then the platform has an obligation to take it down as soon as it can, and in 24 hours, or in more complex cases in a week. So all these regulations are further restrict the enforcement of freedom of expression, and indirectly strengthen the legitimacy of private regulation, and this consequence I find problematic. We have a very interesting piece of legislation from Florida earlier this year. Florida law aimed to stop private regulation in some ways. So according to the law, if a public figure or a politician publishes or posts something on social media, then it cannot be deleted, it is protected speech, if it is protected by legal regulation as well. A district court made a decision that is not compatible with federal law, that is Communications Decency Act, Section 230, and it's also unconstitutional, goes against the doctrines of the First Amendment. So the Florida law is basically non-existent, not in force, but still an interesting attempt. We have the EU's proposal, Digital Services Act proposal, published last December, and we have an online safety bill in the United Kingdom. They both aim to strengthen certain procedural guarantees for the protection of user speech, so not directly concentrating on the protection of content, but on the procedure guarantees, and I think that these are steps forward, though they don't really say anything about the curation problem and the so-called editing issue. We also have a Polish proposal on the table, but I deliberately left it out from the slide because I strongly hope that our Polish friends will have a word on that. It's a very interesting piece of proposal. So some quick conclusions, only valid today because all these things change so quickly. Probably the judicial system or a public authority, media regulatory authority especially, will not be able to handle the workload associated with the operation of these platforms. So the notice and takedown system will remain in place. And this outsourcing of the application of legal doctrines will stay with us for the foreseeable future. The proposed regulation of the EU, that is the Digital Services Act proposal, and some ideas at national level aim to strengthen users' freedom of expression, and that is something that should be warmly welcomed by all free speech scholars and media lawyers. Also, the private law solution, so the contract between platforms and its users, provide opportunity to protect user speech more effectively than it is now the case. And media regulatory solutions widely known in Europe can at least inspire future regulation of platforms and maybe restrict these so far unrestricted editing practices by the platforms, which I find problematic from the perspective of the democratic public sphere. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was really a very interesting presentation on the possible ways to regulate somehow this whole sphere.